Gushan Lax, a being of remarkably little ambition, had dedicated a significant portion of his 245 rotational cycles to perfecting the art of apathy. If queried about his life's aspirations, Gushan would have offered a vacant stare before expressing a desire for a quiet, unremarkable existence. This ironically perfect lack of ambition landed him a position at the Zancha Prime Wellness Center, a sanctuary for intergalactic species on the verge of nervous breakdowns. Stress, it seemed, was a universal affliction, even for life forms without traditional nervous systems. Gushan's role was to lead holistic motion harmony, which, in simpler terms, was yoga instruction. He guided stressed Plin, disjointed Zargoth, and occasionally vibrating Saurians into states of such profound calm that they risked collapsing into black holes. His 6 arms were well suited for demonstrations, and his soothing voice, once described as a waterfall of beige, could pacify even the twitchiest of glands. Gushan Lax had, it seemed, found his niche. Then, the humans arrived. Gushan Lax wasn't a being known for his ambition. He had, in fact, devoted a considerable portion of his 245 rotational cycles to the pursuit of supreme indifference. Had anyone inquired about his life goals, Gushan would have likely offered a vacant expression before stating his preference for a quiet, inconspicuous life. This, ironically, made him perfectly suited for the Zancha Prime Wellness Center, a haven for intergalactic beings teetering on the precipice of mental collapse. Stress, it turned out, was a universal malady, even for organisms lacking traditional nervous systems. Gushan's designated purpose was to instruct holistic motion harmony, a Zanian bureaucratic euphemism for yoga. He was tasked with guiding anxious Plin, discombobulated Zargoth, and the occasionally oscillating Saurians into states of tranquility so profound they ran the risk of unintentional singularity formation. His 6 limbs proved advantageous for demonstrations, and his gentle voice, once likened to a cascading stream of beige by a participant, possessed the power to soothe even the most agitated glands. All things considered, Gushan Lax had discovered his sanctuary. Then, the humans made their entrance. The galaxy held a certain perception of Deathworlders, a cattle term for species originating from planets actively hostile to life. Deathworlders were known for their resilience, unpredictability, and a penchant for destruction, be it objects, bones, or the very fabric of physics. Humans, of course, were the quintessential embodiment of this concept. Their inclusion in the yoga class, Gushan would later maintain, was a clerical error. The memo, while extending an invitation to all species for relaxation and inner harmony, had neglected the crucial exclusionary clause, except Deathworlders. On the morning of the inaugural class, Gushan floated serenely in the center of Studio 17B, enveloped in stillness. Soft Zanian pan flute melodies drifted through the air. The mats were arranged in perfect symmetry. It was, Gushan mused, shaping up to be a most excellent day. Then, Rick arrived. "Morning, folks," Rick boomed, despite the prevailing silence. He was a compact, powerfully built human attired in vibrant shorts and a t-shirt emblazoned with the slogan, "Calm is for quitters." 6 other humans trailed behind him, equally exuberant and remarkably loud for a species without built-in audio amplification. Gushan watched with mounting apprehension as Rick flung his mat onto the floor with the force of a declaration of war. "Let's do this," he declared. Never tried alien yoga before, but hey, how tough can it be? The Zargoth beside him, a spindly being with limbs seemingly assembled at random, whimpered audibly. "Welcome to holistic motion harmony," Gushan managed, his voice trembling slightly. "Today's focus will be on the breath, the body, and the mind." Rick cracked his knuckles. "Nice. Always good to focus on breathing, right? Keeps you going." Gushan, choosing to ignore the comment, initiated the class. Let us commence with the pose of the restful starfish. This, in Gushan's extensive experience, was the simplest of poses. One merely reclined flat on the mat, extended one's limbs, and embraced tranquility. Other species adored it, the Plorans, for instance, frequently wept with gratitude at its ease of execution. Rick, however, took one look at the pose and exclaimed, "Nah, man, I can do better." Before Gushan could intervene, Rick launched himself into a handstand, his face turning a shade of deep purple, but a broad smile splitting his features. What is he doing? Hissed a saurian, vibrating with an unsettling intensity. It's the starfish, but extreme. Rick explained, balancing on one arm while giving a thumbs up with the other. Humans, it appeared, possessed an innate inability to refrain from embellishment. Gushan watched in horror as the other humans, inspired by Rick's audacious display, began their own interpretations of the restful starfish. One commenced doing push-ups, another started clapping while inverted, and a Plin, overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events, collapsed onto its mat, whispering, this was supposed to be calming. Gushan clenched all 6 of his fists. Please, he implored, his carefully cultivated composure beginning to fracture, this is a session for inner peace. Rick, dismounting from his handstand with a resounding thud, sat cross-legged as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Got it, coach, he declared. Calm. Super calm. Gushan, exhaling slowly and opting for a swift change of pace, announced, let us proceed to the pose of the timid tree. Find your balance. Stand on one leg. Embrace stillness. The humans exchanged glances. Rick grinned. Oh, this is going to be interesting, he remarked. Gushan had never truly grasped the nuances of the term balance until he witnessed the humans' attempts to attain it. To be clear, the pose of the timid tree was not inherently complex. One simply stood on one leg, raised one's arms slowly like the branches of a sapling, and breathed in serenity, breathing out stress. Species across the galaxy encountered difficulty with this pose, primarily due to being top-heavy, bottom-heavy, or, in the case of the saurians, vibrating at a molecular level. Humans, however, did something far more perplexing than struggle. They excelled, and they excelled in the unique manner of Deathworlders, by instantly transforming the exercise into a competitive event. Rick, the self-proclaimed leader of the human contingent, was the first to, let's say, reinterpret the pose. He confidently announced the tree pose as easy, planted one foot firmly on the mat, and promptly hoisted his other leg onto his shoulder. Gushan blinked. This was not the pose he had in mind. I call this one the flexible oak, Rick announced with a grin, wobbling slightly as his fellow humans erupted in cheers and applause. Stop applauding him! Gushan barked, his carefully cultivated calm beginning to splinter. This is about inner tranquility, not acrobatic exhibitions. Meanwhile, a Zargoth, whose limbs bent at angles suggesting a long and complicated history with gravity, desperately tried to mimic Rick's modified pose. The result was a sound akin to an overburdened tree groaning under the weight of a sudden storm. I'm balancing. I think, it whimpered before collapsing sideways onto a nearby Plin. The Plin, startled, immediately reverted to its gelatinous emergency puddle state with a faint, defeated splurch star. Gushan buried 2 of his 6 hands in his face. Please, he pleaded, his voice strained, just stand on one leg. Do not attempt to invent new poses. Understood? Rick, ever agreeable, responded brightly, understood, coach, and promptly stood on both hands instead. What are you doing ? Gushan cried, his voice rising in pitch. Balancing, Rick responded, as if this were the most self-evident truth in the universe. Emboldened by their leader's innovative approach, the other humans began contorting themselves into shapes that resembled abstract art sculptures rather than yoga practitioners. One had folded himself into something he proudly dubbed the twisted trunk, while another attempted a headstand that looked suspiciously like an engineering experiment gone horribly awry. Does this count as serenity? A human woman called from across the studio, balanced precariously on her elbows while reciting what sounded like limericks. No. Gushan yelled, it absolutely does not. Hey, look at me, shouted another human, this one named Bartholomew, because humans, it seemed, enjoyed unnecessarily complicated names. Bartholomew had somehow managed to stand on a Zargoth's head, using the alien spindly limbs as impromptu crutches. The Zargoth, visibly close to fainting, croaked, I did not agree to this. Gushan whirled around, his breathing shallow, his 6 eyes darting across the studio. Everywhere he looked, the carefully constructed temple of calm he'd spent years cultivating was collapsing into a writhing, chaotic circus. The saurians were vibrating at such an alarming frequency that one of them began to hum ominously, as if on the verge of spontaneous combustion. The plin had abandoned their mats entirely, resigning themselves to amorphous blobs of quivering jelly on the floor. And somewhere near the back, a human had somehow coaxed two glands into stacking themselves into what could only be described as a totem pole of utter despair. "Are you certain," Gushan whispered to a plin who had oozed to the edge of the studio, "that these creatures understand the purpose of this class?" Gushan's eye twitched. "No," he admitted, "no, I am not certain of that at all." Rick, meanwhile, was now hopping on one hand in circles. "Gotta keep it interesting, Coach," he shouted, as if Gushan were the referee in a game no one else had agreed to play. "This is not interesting," Gushan bellowed, his voice cracking like an overstretched wire. "This is supposed to be relaxing the opposite of whatever this is." Rick paused mid-hop, his upside-down face radiating innocent confusion. "But I am relaxed. This is great." Gushan opened his mouth to respond, but all that came out was a strangled noise somewhere between a sob and a hiccup. At that precise moment, one of the Zargoths collapsed sideways into the stack of glands, toppling the totem pole like a sack of disgruntled noodles. "Timber!" Rick shouted gleefully, still upside down. Gushan Lax had seen a lot in his long career. He had soothed panicking plin during gravity outages. He had taught saurians to meditate through catastrophic atmospheric implosions. He had once even guided a Zargoth through a 45-minute breathing exercise, despite the fact that Zargoths don't have lungs. But this was too much. "Enough!" Gushan screamed, all six arms flailing wildly as the Zanian pan flute music swelled inappropriately in the background. "This is not yoga. This is not harmony. This is madness." Rick, finally flipping back onto his feet, dusted off his hands. "If this is madness, Coach," he declared, "then I'm here for it." Gushan stared at him, his face contorted in the kind of quiet despair usually reserved for beings who have just realized their entire life's work is irreparably ruined. Somewhere in the chaos, a saurian buzzed quietly, "Are we still breathing deeply?" Gushan sank slowly to the floor, burying his head in all six hands. The humans, naturally, applauded. Gushan watched in abject terror as the other humans, seemingly inspired by Rick's reckless bravado, embarked on their own personalized interpretations of the restful starfish. One began a series of vigorous push-ups, another started rhythmically clapping while inverted, and a nearby plin, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden and unexpected deviation from tranquility, simply crumpled onto its mat, muttering something that sounded suspiciously like, "I thought this was meant to be calming." Gushan clenched all six of his fists, his carefully cultivated aura of serenity beginning to crumble around the edges. "Please," he implored, his voice strained, "this is meant to be a time for inner peace, not this." Rick, dismounting from his handstand with a thud that resonated throughout the studio, sat cross-legged as if nothing unusual had transpired. "Right, Coach," he declared with a grin. "Calm. Got it. Super calm." Gushan, drawing a deep, steadying breath and deciding a rapid change of pace was the best course of action, announced, "Let us move on to the pose of the timid tree. Find your balance. Stand on one leg. Embrace stillness." The humans exchanged knowing glances. Rick grinned, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Oh, this," he said, rubbing his hands together, "this is going to be good." Gushan Lax had never truly grasped the multifaceted nature of the concept of balance until he witnessed the humans' attempts at achieving it. To put it simply, the pose of the timid tree was not inherently difficult. One merely stood on a single leg, raised one's arms gracefully, mimicking the branches of a young tree, and inhaled peace while exhaling stress. Species from across the galaxy often encountered challenges with this pose, primarily due to being disproportionately weighted, either top-heavy, bottom-heavy, or in the case of the saurians, vibrating with enough intensity to rival a small earthquake. Humans, however, did something far more baffling than simply struggle. They succeeded, but they succeeded in the peculiar manner often associated with Deathworlders, by instantaneously transforming a simple exercise into a fiercely competitive event. Rick, the self-appointed alpha of the human pack, was, as expected, the first to dramatically reimagine the pose. He confidently declared the tree pose child's play, firmly planted one foot on the mat, and then, with a surprising amount of agility, hoisted his other leg onto his shoulder. Gushan blinked. This was not the intended form. I call this the flexible oak, Rick announced, his voice brimming with pride, wobbling only slightly as his human companions erupted in a chorus of cheers and applause. Cease your applause! Gushan barked, his carefully cultivated composure shattering into a million pieces. This exercise is centered around inner peace, not acrobatic displays. Meanwhile, a Zargoth, whose limbs seemed to defy the very laws of physics, made a valiant attempt to replicate Rick's improvised posture. The resultant noise resembled the tortured groan of an ancient tree about to succumb to a violent storm. I believe. I am balanced, it whimpered, before collapsing sideways onto a nearby plin. The startled plin, overwhelmed by the unexpected weight and sheer absurdity of the situation, immediately reverted to its default state, a gelatinous puddle of quivering protoplasm, accompanied by a faint, defeated splurch star. Gushan buried 2 of his 6 hands in his face, a gesture of profound exasperation. Please, he pleaded, his voice laced with a mixture of desperation and defeat, simply stand on one leg. Do not attempt to invent new poses. Is that understood? Rick, ever the agreeable student, responded with a bright, understood, coach, and promptly stood on both hands instead. What in the cosmos are you doing now? Gushan cried, his voice rising in pitch and volume. Balancing, Rick replied, as if this were the most self-evident truth in all of creation. Emboldened by their leader's innovative approach, the other humans began contorting their bodies into shapes that more closely resembled abstract art sculptures than yoga practitioners. One had somehow folded himself into what he proudly declared was the twisted trunk, while another attempted a headstand that bordered on a catastrophic engineering failure. Does this qualify as serenity? A human woman called out from across the studio, balanced precariously on her elbows while reciting something that sounded remarkably like a series of increasingly bizarre limericks. No! Gushan bellowed, his voice echoing through the once peaceful studio. It most certainly does not. Hey, look at me! Another human, named Bartholomew, because humans, it seemed, had a fondness for overly complex names, shouted across the studio. Bartholomew had, through some feat of improbable acrobatics, managed to perch himself atop a Zargoth's head, using the alien spindly limbs as makeshift support. The Zargoth, clearly on the verge of unconsciousness, croaked weakly, I did not consent to this arrangement. Gushan spun around, his breathing shallow and rapid, his 6 eyes darting frantically around the studio. Everywhere he looked, the meticulously crafted sanctuary of tranquility he had painstakingly cultivated over the years was crumbling into a writhing, chaotic spectacle. The saurians were vibrating at such a high frequency that one of them emitted a low, ominous hum, as if on the precipice of spontaneous combustion. The plin had completely abandoned their designated mats, resigning themselves to their natural state, amorphous blobs of quivering jelly scattered across the floor. And somewhere in the back of the studio, a human had somehow persuaded 2 glands to stack themselves into what could only be described as a totem pole of abject misery. Are you absolutely certain, Gushan whispered to a plin that had oozed its way to the edge of the room, that these individuals comprehend the fundamental principles of this class? Gushan's eye twitched involuntarily. No, he admitted, his voice laced with a mixture of despair and disbelief, no, I am not at all certain of that. Rick, meanwhile, had progressed from his handstand and was now hopping on one hand in a circle, a feat of balance that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Gotta keep things dynamic, coach, he yelled, as if Gushan were the referee in some bizarre game no one else had agreed to participate in. This is not dynamic. Gushan bellowed, his voice cracking under the strain. This is meant to be soothing . The polar opposite of whatever this is. Rick paused mid-hop, his upside-down face radiating genuine bewilderment. But I am soothed. This is fantastic. Gushan opened his mouth to retort, but the only sound that emerged was a strangled noise somewhere between a sob and a hiccup. Just then, one of the Zargoths lost its precarious balance and toppled sideways into the precariously balanced stack of glands, sending the entire totem pole crashing to the floor like a pile of disgruntled noodles. "Timber!" Rick shouted gleefully, still balanced precariously on one hand. Gushan Lax had witnessed many unusual things throughout his extensive career. He had calmed panicking Plin during unexpected gravity fluctuations. He had instructed Saurians on meditative techniques during catastrophic atmospheric implosions. He had even, on one memorable occasion, guided a Zargoth through a 45-minute breathing exercise, despite the biological fact that Zargoths don't possess lungs. But this was beyond anything he had ever encountered. "Enough," he shrieked, all 6 of his arms flailing wildly as the soothing Xanian pan flute music continued to play, utterly inappropriate for the current state of utter pandemonium. "This is not yoga. This is not harmony. This is sheer, unadulterated madness." Rick, finally righting himself, dusted off his hands with a nonchalant air. "If this is madness, Coach," he declared with a grin, "then I'm all in." Gushan stared at him, his face a mask of the quiet despair typically reserved for beings who have just come to the devastating realization that their life's work is irrevocably and utterly ruined. Somewhere amidst the chaos, a Saurian buzzed faintly, "Are we still supposed to be engaging in deep, controlled breathing?" Gushan sank slowly to the floor, burying his head in all 6 of his hands. The humans, of course, erupted in applause. The ensuing 17 minutes, which felt like 17 lifetimes to the beleaguered Gushan Lax, were a maelstrom of unmitigated chaos. The humans, now thoroughly emboldened and operating under a self-imposed state of anarchy, had ceased paying any attention whatsoever to Gushan's increasingly desperate instructions. Rick, their de facto leader, had somehow transformed the yoga class into what he proudly proclaimed to be extreme Zen conditioning, a phrase that Gushan had absolutely no idea how to translate into any known galactic language. It was becoming increasingly apparent to Gushan that the humans were not merely stretching their physical bodies, they were stretching the very fabric of sanity itself. Near the front of the studio, Bartholomew had enlisted the assistance of 2 Plin in his latest experiment, which involved the pose of the bending willow. Since Plin were, by nature, gelatinous, this primarily consisted of Bartholomew stacking them like intergalactic pancakes while attempting to perform a split. "Bartholomew!" Gushan snapped, his voice edged with despair. "What, pray tell, are you doing?" "Improvising, Coach." Bartholomew replied cheerfully, his limbs contorted at angles that defied both anatomy and gravity. "Willows bend, right? So I'm bending." The Plin beneath him gurgled faintly, a sound that Gushan could only interpret as the muffled cries of sentient jelly. Further back in the studio, Rick had taken it upon himself to assist the Zargoths in improving their flexibility. Zargoths, being creatures with skeletal systems so fragile they looked as if they might spontaneously disintegrate at any moment, were not, by any stretch of the imagination, designed for flexibility. "Come on, buddy, you got this." Rick encouraged one trembling Zargoth, whose limbs were shaking like twigs in a hurricane. "I don't think this is advisable," the Zargoth whimpered, the joints in its foreknees audibly creaking. "Nonsense. You're a mighty oak," Rick declared, slapping the Zargoth's back with such enthusiasm that its legs buckled, sending the alien crumpling to the mat like a discarded deck chair. "See? Progress," Rick exclaimed triumphantly. Gushan Lax's breathing had now escalated to a state he could only describe as panicked hyperventilation. "Why are you doing this?" he cried, his 6 arms flapping helplessly. "Yoga is about stillness. Peace. Calm." Rick, completely unfazed, turned to face him with an expression of utter sincerity. "It's also about growth, Coach. Growth comes from challenge. That's why we're challenging ourselves." "No." Gushan barked, his voice hitting octaves typically reserved for emergency sirens. "This is not growth. This is a slow-motion catastrophe. You are violating every fundamental principle of yoga." Rick frowned, as though Gushan had just informed him that gravity was optional. "Violating? I think we're redefining it." At that precise moment, a saurian, whose body had been oscillating at a dangerously high frequency, finally reached its vibrational limit and exploded into a harmless puff of glittering dust. "Oops," one of the humans muttered from the back of the studio. "Is that normal?" "No," Gushan shrieked, his voice echoing through the studio. "It is absolutely not normal. You have destabilized the saurians. You have flattened the Zargoths. The plane are weeping puddles of despair." I? Deep breaths, Coach, Rick interrupted helpfully. "In through the nose, out through the mouth. That's what you told us, right?" Gushan Lax froze, his vision narrowing. The words and deep breaths echoed in his mind like a discordant choir. "I told you that," Gushan said slowly, "to help you find inner peace, not so you could turn this sacred practice into a Deathworlder demolition derby." "Oh, we're not demolishing anything," Rick protested, just before tripping over a collapsed plane and knocking over 2 humans and an unfortunate clone like a set of cosmic bowling pins. Gushan screamed into the void of his own soul. The subsequent 17 minutes, which stretched out like an eternity in Gushan Lax's weary mind, were a whirlwind of pure, unadulterated chaos. The humans, now emboldened by their own audacity and fueled by an unspoken pact of anarchy, had ceased paying even the slightest heed to Gushan's increasingly frantic instructions. Rick, their unofficial leader, had somehow transmogrified the yoga session into what he proudly declared extreme Zen conditioning, a term that Gushan couldn't begin to comprehend, let alone translate into any recognized galactic dialect. It was becoming increasingly evident to Gushan that these humans weren't simply pushing their physical limitations, they were actively assaulting the very boundaries of sanity itself. Near the front of the studio, Bartholomew, ever the innovator, had enlisted the aid of Tu Plin in his latest endeavor, a daring reimagining of the pose of the bending willow. Given that Plin were inherently gelatinous, this primarily entailed Bartholomew stacking them like intergalactic pancakes while attempting to execute a split. "Bartholomew!" Gushan snapped, his voice brittle with despair. "What, in the name of all that is holy, are you doing?" "Improvising, Coach!" Bartholomew replied cheerfully, his limbs contorted at angles that defied both anatomical possibility and the fundamental laws of physics. "Willows bend, yeah? So I'm bending." The plin beneath him emitted a faint gurgling sound, a noise that Gushan could only interpret as the muffled cries of a sentient jelly. Further back in the studio, Rick had appointed himself the personal flexibility coach of the Zargoths. Zargoths, beings whose skeletal systems were so delicate they appeared as though they might spontaneously disintegrate at the slightest provocation, were, to put it mildly, not built for flexibility. "Come on, buddy, you can do it." Rick encouraged one trembling Zargoth, whose limbs were quaking like saplings in a gale-force wind. "I have a strong premonition that this is ill-advised," the Zargoth whimpered, the joints in its fur knees emitting an audible creaking sound. "Nonsense! You're a mighty oak," Rick declared, slapping the Zargoth on the back with such unrestrained enthusiasm that its legs buckled, sending the alien crumpling to the mat like a discarded lawn chair. "There you go. Progress!" Rick exclaimed, beaming with pride. Gushan Lax's breathing had now escalated to the point of frantic hyperventilation. Why are you doing this?" he cried, his 6 arms flapping helplessly in the air. "Yoga is about stillness, tranquility, inner peace." Rick, entirely unperturbed by Gushan's distress, turned to face him with an expression of utter sincerity. "It's also about growth, Coach. Growth comes from pushing your boundaries. That's what we're doing, pushing our boundaries." "No!" Gushan shrieked, his voice reaching octaves typically associated with emergency alarms. "This is not growth. This is a slow-motion train wreck. You're violating every single tenet of yoga." Rick frowned, as if Gushan had just informed him that the laws of gravity were merely suggestions. "Violating? I think we're revolutionizing it." At that very moment, a saurian, whose body had been oscillating at a dangerously high frequency, finally reached its vibrational threshold and dissolved into a harmless puff of shimmering dust. "Oops," one of the humans muttered from the back of the room. "Is that supposed to happen?" No! Gushan shrieked, his voice reverberating through the studio. It is absolutely not supposed to happen. You've destabilized the Saurians. You've flattened the Zargoths. The Plin are weeping puddles of existential dread. I? Deep breaths, Coach, Rick interjected helpfully. In through the nose, out through the mouth. That's what you told us, right? Gushan Lax froze, his vision tunneling. The words deep breaths echoed in his mind, distorted and mocking. I told you that, Gushan said slowly, his voice trembling, so that you could find inner peace, not so that you could turn this sacred practice into a Deathworlder demolition derby. Oh, we're not demolishing anything, Rick protested, just before tripping over a collapsed Plin and knocking over 2 fellow humans and an unfortunate Gloan like a set of cosmic bowling pins. Gushan emitted a wordless scream into the existential void. From a quiet corner, a timid voice squeaked, "Excuse me." Gushan turned sharply. A small, jellyfish-like alien hovered at the edge of the chaos, its bioluminescent tendrils blinking nervously. Yes? Gushan said, seizing on the distraction like a drowning man clutching at a piece of driftwood. I was just wondering, the jellyfish stammered, about refunds? This isn't quite what I signed up for. Gushan blinked. Refunds? The jellyfish nodded, its glowing head bobbing. Yes. I paid for tranquility. And this seems to be, this. It gestured vaguely at the room, where Rick had somehow managed to convince 2 other humans to use him as a makeshift balance beam. Refunds, Gushan muttered blankly, his mind, which had been operating on fumes for the past 20 minutes, finally giving up the ghost. Rick strode over, wiping sweat from his brow with a triumphant grin. Coach, I gotta say, this has been the best workout of my life. Gushan turned to him, his face a mask of utter hopelessness. Workout? This is *yoga star. Yeah, yoga. Mind, body, spirit, right? And we're pushing all 3 to the limit. Gushan stared at Rick for a long moment, then sank onto his mat, burying his face in all 6 hands. I need to lie down. Good idea, Rick said brightly. That's probably the next pose, huh? What do you call it? Gushan lifted his head just enough to glare at Rick. The pose of the instructor who has given up. Sounds peaceful, Rick replied, already rolling onto his back. Around them, the chaos continued unabated.